Barry Sussman called me and said, come on in. We've got this burglary at the Democratic headquarters. I thought it meant the local D.C., District of Columbia headquarters, not the national.
Bob's being a little overly modest. He had been at the paper a short time, but he had established a record of doing really quite remarkable police stories. And he was called in not because he was foolish enough, because they wanted him because of how well he had done on some of these investigative stories, actually.
The Watergate Hotel apartment complex, headquarters of the Democratic National Committee, 5 men entered and broke in. We later learned it was not the first time they had entered that office. They were actually back on the evening of the 17th to fix a eavesdropping device. So you get the call, come to work. Carl Bernstein, where were you on the Saturday morning of the 18th?
I was sitting at my typewriter finishing a profile of a man running for governor of Virginia because I was the chief Virginia correspondent, and I saw all this activity over by the city desk. And by then I had had 12 years in the business, even though I was only 28, and I could see there was some kind of good story going on, and like any good reporter, I wanted a piece of the good story.
You could smell the buzz.
So I went up to the city editor and I said, hey, I'll make some checks here for you. You want me to call some people? And I got on the phone and started calling into the Watergate, calling waiters and maitre d's, and indeed the calls were fruitful. That day, Bob went to the courthouse. He can tell you what he learned there, and I found out that these burglars were 5 Cubans, all of whom had CIA connections.
On the back of your book it says, Bernstein looked across the newsroom. There was a pillar between his desk and Woodward's about 25 feet away. He stepped back several paces. It appeared that Woodward was also working on the story. They had never worked on a story together. Woodward was 29, Bernstein 28. You didn't know each other very well.
No, I thought he was an old man because I had followed his byline. He was always writing stories about the anti-war movement and so forth, and had a very graceful, seemingly experienced style. And I was shocked to discover that he was a year younger than myself. I thought he was 50 or 40 or something like that. I did.
Did you think Woodward's getting this story? It's going to be a big story or an interesting story? Did you have any clue it was a story of real consequence and magnitude?
I think so. I think by the end of that first day, learning that the burglars had CIA connections, I thought it was going to be a big story. Did I think it would lead to Richard Nixon? Absolutely not. And I wrote a long memo the next day to the city editor why I thought it might well be a CIA operation. It never occurred to me that the President of the United States might have been responsible.
But see, this is where there is, in the news business, a weekend lull, which we all live with. And what happened, this was on a Saturday, there was a story Sunday on the front page that said there was this break-in, it was mysterious, there was a wonderful paragraph that somebody put in there. Maybe it was Carl, that we don't know who sponsored this or who might have been behind it, or what their purpose. It could not be determined
was the beginning of that paragraph. When today do you see a story in which a reporter acknowledges it could not be determined? There was a big difference in the attitude of the
admission
press.
that we don't know everything.
Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Immediately.
Yes,
absolutely.
And that the mystery is bigger than the evidence we are giving.
And bigger than
now.
us. Yeah. I mean, well, I think an awful lot of what we see today is the press being omniscient, looking omniscient.
Let me just make this point, though. So the story ran Sunday morning. Sunday is, again, another day off. We're the two who come to the office, and it's the AP who has a story saying one of the burglars is James McCord, who's the security chief of the President's Re-Election Committee.
We got beat the first day out.
But we then did that story.
But then light bulbs went off.
You say now, hey, wait a minute.
Exactly.
This isn't your
CIA,
average burglar.
Exactly.
This is not your average.
My CIA memo was dusted.
This is not your average burglar. These are not your average reporters. We have to take a quick break. A lot more of Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein coming up right after this.
Did you call the White House press office? I went over there. I talked to them. They said Hunt hadn't worked there for 3 months. Then a PR guy said this weird thing. He said, I'm convinced that neither Mr. Colson or anyone else at the White House had any knowledge of or participation in this deplorable incident at the Democratic National Committee? Isn't that what you expect me to say? Absolutely. So, I never asked about Watergate. I simply asked what were Hunt's duties at the White House.
The story is dry. All we've got are pieces. We can't seem to figure out what the puzzle is supposed to look like. John Mitchell resigns as the head of Creek and says that he wants to spend more time with his family. Sounds like bullshit. We don't exactly believe that.
No, but it's touching. Forget the myths that the media's created about the White House. The truth is, these are not very bright guys, and things got out of hand.
Hunt's come in from the cold. Supposedly he's got a lawyer with $25,000 in a brown paper bag.
Follow the money.
What do you mean? Where?
Oh, I can't tell you that.
But you could tell me.
No, I have to do this my way. You tell me what you know, and I'll confirm. I'll keep you in the right direction if I can, but that's all. Just follow the money.
Just follow the money. That's Bob Woodward with Deep Throat. You began to report that this wasn't just a burglary, a wiretap. There was now a huge cover-up.
Yes, but the money was the key to understand. One of the crucial stories we did in this, Carl went to Florida and got the checks, the Mexican checks, and another $25,000 check that had been deposited in the bank accounts of one of the burglars. Now, these were campaign checks. Turns out that one of the $25,000 checks actually had come from a big campaign contributor in Minnesota and gone to Maurice Stans, who was the head of the finance committee. The day we ran that story, which was August 1st, 1972, so what, 6 weeks after the Watergate burglary, we now know from the Nixon tapes that very day Nixon was meeting with Haldeman, and the issue of paying hush money to the burglars for their silence came up, and Nixon actually said they have to be paid. There is no alternative. There's nothing we can do. So Nixon's hand is in this much larger than we even had.
And even earlier, and much earlier than indeed has been known up till now. Now these tapes show something new.
Let's talk about that. So you believe very clearly that Richard Nixon authorized hush money by the silence of people.
Yes, but what the key event was, we learned that there was a secret fund that had been controlled by 5 aides to the president, and that fund was being used to orchestrate the cover-up in one way or another. And when we learned that, one of the things that we left out of all the president's men, Bob and I would meet each morning in a little vending machine room outside the newsroom, because we had to really sometimes fight our editors to get in the paper what we thought should get in the paper. There was a lot of tension. We would get our stories straight in the morning, and then we'd go in. And on this occasion, we had just found out about this secret fund that, among others, the Attorney General of the United States controlled, John Mitchell. And I suddenly turned to Bob and I said, my God, this president is going to be impeached. And this was in September of 1972. I don't know where that thought came from, but I felt this chill. I mean, because nobody had ever uttered the word impeachment. And Woodward turned to me and he said, my God, you're right, and we can never use that word in this newsroom lest somebody think we have an agenda.
Do you believe that Richard Nixon authorized the break-in? Or knew of the break-in?
No, there's no evidence on the tapes or in the testimony. I mean, there are conversations. Remember, we've chased little stories even a number of years ago. You were talking to somebody
who did, and what were they after?
Well, to this day, we don't know with certainty. What we do know is that Nixon was well aware there was an intelligence-gathering opposition operation against the opposition. Whether he knew the details ahead of time of what they were doing, we don't know. You know, you need to set the scene a little bit about what was going on at the time. This was at the height of the anti-war movement, among other things. And Nixon was being vilified for not getting out of Vietnam earlier. And
George McGovern was the Democratic candidate, castigating the president daily.
Right. And one of the things that we do know that Nixon was after when he ordered the firebombing of the Brookings Institution was material relating to the Vietnam War. And that he might have wanted to use that for his own purposes rather than have his political opponents have that information.
But when you look at the whole record now,